Will Nigel Farage win when he stands to be MP in Clacton again? Only one person to ask, the nation's foremost expert on political public opinion, Sir John Curtice, the Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. Morning, John.
Good morning to you, Stig.
My inexpert view is that he's obviously going to win. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the honest truth is that, he wouldn't have gone down this path if he wasn't pretty confident of winning, even if all the other parties had been willing to stand against him. He got 46% of the vote in the constituency in 2024. Reform is still much more popular then nationally than they were back in 2024. You'd expect Mr Farage to be able to get over half of the vote in Clacton at the moment. But of course, the other people aren't wanting to play ball. He's called for a match of football, but none of the other kids want to play. And so much as happened to David Davis when he resigned as the MP for Halton Price and Howden back in 2008 over questions of civil liberties, when neither Labour nor the Democrats stood against him. He got 72% of the vote, but against a whole string of independent and other party candidates, but it was inevitably something of a hollow victory. But I presume that Mr Farage will be returning to the House of Commons before the Commons returns from its summer holidays at the beginning of September.
John, is it possible? So say Count Binface, a sort of deliberate, sort of performance art he does when he stands against these figures, but he will be a protest candidate. Is there a realm in which he could get 15%, 18% or something of the vote, and then Farage has to stand there with a man dressed as a bin who gets a body of a vote that makes it kind of interesting or noteworthy?
Yeah, I mean, that might happen. It depends a little bit now on how many smaller candidates there were. I mean, there were 28% of people who voted against David Davis, but nobody got more than 7% because there was a very, very large numbers of people. And it may well be, for example, we wait and see, a party Rejoin EU, which we don't usually hear a great deal about, whether or not they will say, well, this is our chance to stand against him and perhaps to get a decent share of the vote, because after all, Mr Farage is the art Brexiteer. Well, we'll have to wait and see. We can't rule out the possibility that at least there will be somebody who stands who at least is something of a credible alternative. But again, I think the truth is, in so doing, they would be providing Mr Farage with a bit of competition, but not necessarily threatening his future as the MP for Clacton.
Do you know what struck us this morning when we were thinking about that? Because the obvious thing people remember is Martin Bell standing against the Hamiltons.
Sure.
And it strikes me that not only is there no one who the country could agree on as a sort of anti-corruption candidate anymore, but no one would risk themselves because they know they're going to antagonise 30-35% of a base who are going to be very vicious and angry at them. So the notion of a sort of middle way independent candidate feels very 1990s rather than very 2020s.
Well, of course, in that instance, Martin Bell was standing against a Conservative, and it was Labour and the Democrats who essentially both agreed to stand out in favour at a time when the focus was very much on getting rid of a then Conservative government, and indeed a lot of voters did vote tactically against the Conservative government at that stage. The difficulty here, of course, is that getting Conservative and Labour to agree with each other on a candidate, very difficult to conceive of. Maybe Labour, the Greens and Liberal Democrats, but even there at the moment, the truth, of course, is that Labour are wanting not necessarily to give the Greens any more credibility, given that they're taking quite a lot of votes off them. Yeah, we are living in a world of fragmented politics, and in a sense, the one thing that all the other parties could agree on is, well, let's not join in the game.
Just finally, Farage wants to make this I think he wants to make this generally for the next general election, establishment versus the people, insurgent against the old, tired way of doing things.
Sure.
Is that like to be an electorally popular thing to be doing?
Well, it's certainly true. If you look at the support the Reform got in 2024, indeed still has currently, one of the characteristics of those people is indeed that they are pretty unhappy about the way in which Britain's being governed. They think it needs a great deal of improvement. So the idea that, as it were, we've been let down by the establishment parties, which is effectively talking about Conservative and Labour as the parties who've governed Britain for most of the time since 1945. That feeling is certainly there amongst Reform voters, but we also have to bear in mind they are also a very distinctive group of people in terms of their values. They're very socially conservative. They're the parts of Britain that are concerned about immigration, who are sceptical about equalities policies, etc. Now, that is a market that Nigel Farage has been able to exploit and gain popularity very, very well. but it is at the end of the day a limited niche market, which is one of the reasons why I think Reform have never managed to get much above 30% in the polls. And at the moment, yes, still ahead, but we have to remember, still only at about 26%. But I think the appeal he made yesterday certainly is one that will probably help him to galvanise his support amongst the section of the electorate that are already inclined to back him in the first place.
John, great to speak to you. Thank you for joining us. That's John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. There is a new YouGov polling out today, which I think is interesting from the point of view that the base is clearly going to be very wound up by Nigel Farage. That's going to work very well for him. 43% of Britons oppose Nigel Farage holding a by-election, 24% support it. So one question which our listeners are wrestling with is, do you feel better about Nigel Farage after the last 24 hours or worse? Which seems to be a very reasonable question. Let's talk to Times Radio newsroom reporter Ollie Cole. Morning, Ollie.
Morning.
Either this by-election is the people versus the establishment, or it's Nigel Farage versus a man who professionally dresses up as a bin.
Yes, it is a difficulty that a lot of people into the evening yesterday were discussing, that actually, have Reform actually prepared themselves for the fact that, everyone else might not run. And the resounding thought was possibly not, because essentially, Nigel Farage is about to go to the people of Clacton and say he's taking on the establishment. The next guy along is going to be dressed as a bin, and it is a difficulty to say that you're taking on the establishment when the establishment that you say is not running. Now, there is a truth to the Reform message, which is going to be for the next 6 to 8 weeks, essentially that this whole by-election is about whether Nigel Farage is telling the truth and whether you believe Nigel Farage over the allegations against him. Now, the Reform message, and I was speaking to some Reform people last night, was, people are running scared and they're not going to, stand against him, because eventually, the establishment are trying to say, this is Nigel Farage, he's covered in sleaze X, Y, Z, and yet they won't stand by their word and run against him. And that's going to be their message for the next 6 to 8 weeks. However, the problem is, for Nigel Farage, is in this by-election, it's going to look like a bit of a farce for the next 6 to 8 weeks, because everyone's going to go to Clacton and find a man campaigning essentially against himself for his own seat.
Could there be two by-elections here? Because one of the reasons he's done this is that if he lost the Standards investigation, was suspended for 10 days in Parliament, there could have been a recall position which would have led to a by-election. That was the possibility of the punishment he was facing. He's now gone ahead of that by calling a by-election himself. The Standards investigation is paused while that happens. Presuming he's re-elected, the Standards investigation reopens again. Is it possible there could be a second by-election, or can the government stop this by-election to get to the end of the Standards investigation? Can anything happen, or is this likely that there'll be one by-election, an investigation, then we see what happens after that?
There's a reality that there's two. Basically, the thought among the actual top of political parties, there is a lot of discussion between backbench MPs as to whether they might be able to amend, the writ that being moved, basically the motion that says that Nigel Farage's election date is X, or, the Clacton election date is Y. And the thought among actual political parties themselves is that that's a bad idea, is that essentially plays in to Nigel Farage and Reform's message, which is that essentially this is an establishment stitch up. They're trying to put every blockade in the way that they can, and that is the thought within a lot of party teams, that that's a bad idea. So what you're going to end up with is a by-election, possibly happening in the first couple of weeks of next month, that essentially pauses an investigation for a few weeks, and then the Standards Commissioner is going to carry that on. We understood yesterday morning, according to my colleagues at the Times, that Nigel Farage was going to be interviewed in the next couple of weeks by the Standards Commissioner. Now, yesterday, Nigel Farage said something interesting, which is that he said there's now a second investigation into me. Well, actually, there isn't, as far as the Standards Commissioner is concerned. If you go onto their website, there's still only one investigation, and it's into the Christopher Harborne £5 million. There isn't a second one yet. So that's still to be launched by the Standards Commissioner officially. So that's going to come back. Now, there is a question then as to whether the Standards Commissioner returns and says, look, I'm going to do all these investigations and conclude at once, or whether he's going to say, well, look, I'm doing one and then there'll be another and it'll be a drip. But there is going to be, at the end of all of this, if Nigel Farage returns to the House of Commons, an investigation and is going to have to conclude in some way, and it will involve some sort of outcome. And there is a sanction that can't be put against Nigel Farage if he doesn't become an MP again. But all those investigations still happen. Yeah. And essentially, this whole problem is purely paused for a bit and then is still awaiting Nigel Farage down the track.
Can Reform pay for this by-election?
So, this is such a weird question, because basically nobody really knows, because I don't think there's any precedent for it at all. The Ministry of Local Government say no. I mean, there has to be obviously a view that elections are free and fair. The local council that Nigel Farage has spoken to haven't really commented yet and haven't really worked it out. I've been speaking to a few people in local government who run elections, and they weren't really sure last night, because they were like, well, we've never been in this situation. But the Ministry of Housing and Local Government say that it can't be done, and that seems to be the resounding view of government. And I think basically that the taxpayer will probably take the hit. And there's always this question over the price of by-elections. You know, we just had one for Andy Burnham, and nobody really kicked off about the price of that apart from the opposition parties, and then it still went ahead and everything sort of turned out fine. So yeah, there is a reality to democracy in this country that it costs a bit of money, and it's probably going to be that.
Just finally, how much of a persecution narrative does Reform want to run? Because from what I can tell, Farage mentioned the media several times in that speech. Jenrick went around yesterday, including a really quite astonishing moment on Sky News where he sort of went after a presenter. There's this sort of false notion of a daughter being hounded by virtue of a single picture being published in the Times of a property owned by Nigel Farage, and then Sky visiting said property and not speaking to the daughter. But that becomes a narrative here, is it? That they're all out to get me, and therefore we're the plucky underdogs.
Yeah, it's one of those difficult things, because I think actually what you saw from that video that Nigel Farage put out yesterday was essentially in 1 hour of the day someone walking up to a door, possibly knocking it, and then another person a few hours later possibly knocking on the door, and then walking away, which I don't think in anyone's books would be hounding. The difficulty is that is standard media practice. That is sort of doorstepping is a thing that happens, and actually some media practices look a bit ugly, and the truth is that a lot of them are in the public interest. A lot of people who are sent out to these things have to work quite hard with a team of lawyers to work out, actually, do I have a public interest case behind me? Is there legal backing for all of this, X, Y, Z? And they have to work out that there is before they even set foot out the door and go and do these things. But the image of that happening can be quite ugly. The image of people chasing people down the street with microphones, etc., is a difficult one. I think it's pretty clear from a media point of view and from most of the public's point of view, the word hounding is probably going a bit far, but this is what Reform UK are going to play this by-election on. They think that this is essentially, to their base, seen as the media, the establishment, the political establishment, keep going after Nigel Farage, and we are putting the public against that. And that is, a big question. Now, interestingly, the call made by Nigel Farage was really not known by anyone except for his inner circle yesterday. And there are people who are stood in the room who were watching that statement that he gave, who genuinely had no idea what was about to come out of his mouth throughout that. So it's a risky tactic that they are playing. Yeah. But obviously Nigel Farage and his really closest aides think that it's one that will work in their favour.
We're going to have to see what happens. Good to speak to you, Ollie.